Imagine a world that works. Not perfectly, nothing ever does, but with a complexity and sophistication that would take humanity more than 1,000 years to rebuild after it was gone. Ships crossing the Mediterranean loaded with copper and tin, with ivory and obsidian, with spices and dyed cloth and letters written by kings to other kings in languages they had learned precisely for the purpose of doing business together. Merchants who knew the ports of a dozen foreign cities. Diplomats who moved freely between courts that spanned from the Nile Delta to the Aegean coast to the highlands of Anatolia. A world, in every meaningful sense, that was already globalized. 3,000 years before anyone used that word. Then, in the space of roughly 50 years, a blink in historical time, it all stopped. The palace of Ugarit, one of the great trading hubs of the ancient world, burned to the ground and was never rebuilt. The Mycenaean Greeks, who had built citadels so massive that later Greeks assumed they must have been constructed by giants, abandoned their cities and forgot how to write. The Hittite Empire, which had squared off against Egypt as an equal and signed what may be history's first surviving peace treaty, vanished so completely that for centuries no one even knew it had existed. Dozens of cities across the eastern Mediterranean show the same archaeological signature: a layer of ash, a scatter of unburied dead, and then silence. What killed them is a question that has haunted archaeologists, historians, and anyone who has ever stared at a palace wall covered in scenes of burning ships and wondered what the people who carved it were actually trying to say. Was it invasion? Revolution from within? The unsettling answer, the one that the evidence keeps pointing toward no matter how many times researchers have tried to find a cleaner explanation, is that it was all of these things, feeding each other. A catastrophe so total and so systemic that no single cause can bear the full weight of explaining it. And that, if you think about it for more than 30 seconds, is the part that should genuinely disturb you. Because this was not a weak civilization. This was not a world on the edge, held together with string and wishful thinking. This was the most sophisticated network of interconnected societies the world had ever produced. They had professional armies, bureaucracies that tracked grain shipments across thousands of miles, diplomatic correspondence so refined that kings apologized to each other for delays in letter writing. It had survived droughts before, internal rebellions before. They had every tool that a civilization is supposed to need in order to endure. And they collapsed anyway. In 2 generations. The ruins are still there. You can walk through them. You can see the doorways that no one ever walked back through, the storage jars that no one ever emptied, the clay tablets that no one ever finished writing. And if you stand in the right place, in the ash layer that marks the end of the Bronze Age world, you can ask the question that this story has always been asking underneath everything else. What does it actually take to bring down a civilization? Not weaken it. Not wound it. The answer is older than Rome, older than Greece, older than almost everything we were ever taught to call ancient. And it is waiting in the ruins. There is a letter sitting in a museum in Berlin that most people will never hear about. It was written around 3,200 years ago, pressed into a clay tablet by a scribe working in the city of Ugarit on the coast of what we now call Syria. The letter is from a merchant. He is complaining, politely, professionally, about a shipment of tin that arrived late and underweight. He names the supplier, he names the port. He references a previous transaction and implies, with the diplomatic precision of someone who has done this 1,000 times, that this kind of unreliability is bad for business. It reads, in other words, like an email. And that is the detail that should stop you cold. Because this man was writing more than a millennium before Rome existed. This is the world we are about to watch die. Not a primitive world of mud huts and superstition, but a sophisticated, interconnected, bureaucratic civilization that stretched across thousands of miles and tied together dozens of distinct cultures into a single functioning system. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age. The people who lived in it probably did not have a name for it at all. To them, it was simply the world. It was the only world they had ever known. And by every measure that matters, it was extraordinary in ways that we have systematically underestimated for centuries. Picture the map. Egypt, at its imperial height under the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, controlling not just the Nile Valley, but vast territories in Canaan and Nubia, projecting power across the entire southern Mediterranean. To the north, in Anatolia, modern Turkey, the Hittite Empire, a military and diplomatic superpower that had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, and then, in a move of breathtaking pragmatism, negotiated a peace treaty with them. A treaty carved in silver, copies of which were kept by both sides. The oldest surviving international peace agreement in human history. These were not barbarian kingdoms. These were states with foreign ministries.
Further west, the Mycenaean Greeks occupied a world that their own descendants would eventually mythologize as the Age of Heroes, because by the time those descendants were writing, they had completely forgotten how to explain the ruins their ancestors had left behind. The citadel of Mycenae was built with stones so massive that later Greeks, unable to imagine human beings moving them, invented a story about a race of giants called Cyclopes who had constructed the walls. What was actually there, behind those walls, was a palace state with administrative records, specialized workshops, professional soldiers, and trade connections that reached from the British Isles to the borders of Mesopotamia. Not giants. Something more impressive than giants. A functioning civilization. And then there was Cyprus, which was perhaps the single most important piece of the entire system. The Saudi Arabia of the Bronze Age. Cyprus sat on top of some of the richest copper deposits in the ancient world, and copper was not a luxury. Copper, combined with tin to make bronze, was the industrial material of the age. It was what weapons were made of, what tools were made of, what the entire military and agricultural infrastructure of every major civilization depended on. Cyprus exported copper in ingots, shaped like stretched animal hides. Ox-hide ingots, archaeologists call them, each one weighing around 25 kilograms, and they move by the shipload across the Mediterranean to ports in Egypt, the Levant, Greece, and Anatolia. The island was not just wealthy, it was structurally essential. What made this world genuinely remarkable, though, was not any single civilization within it. It was the connections between them. Trade in the Late Bronze Age was not the occasional opportunistic exchange of exotic goods between isolated kingdoms. It was a system. Tin, which had to be combined with copper to make bronze, came primarily from sources in Afghanistan and possibly Central Europe, moving through a chain of intermediaries across thousands of miles before it reached the smiths who needed it. Grain moved from Egypt to the Hittites during times of shortage. Luxury goods, lapis lazuli, ivory, ostrich eggs, amber, gold, circulated through diplomatic gift exchanges between royal courts that wrote to each other regularly, addressed each other as brothers, and complained bitterly when the letters stopped coming. There were professional translators. There were standardized weights and measures used across multiple cultures. There were merchant families with business operations running simultaneously in multiple countries.
The correspondence that survives from this period, the Amarna letters, the Ugarit archives, the Hittite royal records, reads less like ancient history and more like the inbox of a multinational corporation with serious personality conflicts. Kings write to each other, requesting specific craftsmen by name. A pharaoh complains that the gold statues his ally sent him were of embarrassingly poor quality. A Hittite king writes to Egypt requesting a doctor because his sister is ill. A ruler in Cyprus assures an Egyptian official that the ships attacking the coast are absolutely not his, which is almost certainly a lie. These are recognizable human beings navigating recognizable political realities. The sophistication is not surprising once you look at it directly. What is surprising is how thoroughly we forgot it. Here is the thing about this world that matters most for everything that comes next. It was not just interconnected, it was interdependent. And those two words are not the same thing. Interconnected means the parts are linked. Interdependent means that if one part fails, the others cannot function without it. The Bronze Age world had built itself into a system where no single civilization could fully sustain itself alone. Egypt needed tin from the east to arm its military. The Hittites needed Egyptian grain when their harvests failed. The Mycenaean Greeks needed copper from Cyprus to keep their palace economies running. Ugarit needed all of them because Ugarit's entire existence was built on being the hub through which everything else moved. Pull out one thread and the whole fabric strains. Pull out several at once, and something far worse than strain begins to happen. By around 1200 BCE, this world had been functioning, more or less, for the better part of 3 centuries. 300 years of palace economies, diplomatic correspondence, long-distance trade, and the quiet accumulation of complexity that comes when sophisticated systems are left to grow unchecked. The palaces had grown larger. The bureaucracies had grown larger. The supply chains had grown longer and more intricate, and more dependent on conditions remaining stable. The kings who ruled these systems had every reason to believe they would continue. They had weathered crises before. The system had always recovered. There was no particular reason, sitting in a palace in Ugarit or Mycenae or Hattusa around 1200 BCE, to believe that the next 50 years would be any different from the last 300. And that certainty, that deep, institutional, civilizational certainty that the system would hold, may have been the most dangerous thing in the world. Because somewhere just beyond the horizon of everything these kings could see, a set of pressures was already building that their system had never truly been tested against. Not individually, but together, all at once, in a sequence that would give no civilization enough time to recover before the next blow landed. The machine that had run the ancient world for 3 centuries was about to discover exactly what it could not survive. And the first lesson it would teach, the first of several that feel uncomfortably familiar today, is this: the most complex systems are not the most resilient ones. They are often, in ways that only become obvious in retrospect, the most fragile. The Bronze Age world was about to prove that in the most devastating way imaginable. Let me tell you about a shipwreck. Around 1200 BCE, a merchant vessel went down off the coast of southern Turkey, near a place called Uluburun. It sat on the ocean floor for 3,000 years before divers found it in 1982, and what they pulled up from that wreck rewrote everything archaeologists thought they understood about the Bronze Age economy. The ship was carrying 10 tons of copper ingots, 1 ton of tin, ebony logs from Africa, glass ingots from Egypt, jars of olives and resin and spices, jewelry, weapons, and a golden scarab that may have belonged to the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. The cargo came from at least 7 different cultures spanning the entire Mediterranean world. This was not a treasure ship. This was a routine commercial voyage. This was Tuesday. That single shipwreck tells you everything you need to know about the scale of what the Bronze Age had built, and everything you need to know about why its collapse was so total. A system that can load 10 tons of copper, 1 ton of tin, and luxury goods from half a dozen civilizations onto a single merchant ship is not a simple system. It is a machine. A machine with hundreds of moving parts, each one dependent on the others, each one representing a human relationship, a trade agreement, a diplomatic understanding, a supply chain stretching back across hundreds of miles. And machines of that complexity have a property that simpler systems do not. When they break, they do not break partially. They break completely. Here is what that machine actually looked like from the inside. Bronze, the metal that gave the age its name, required 2 ingredients that almost never occurred naturally in the same place. Copper was relatively widespread, but the richest deposits were concentrated in Cyprus and a handful of other specific locations. Tin was rarer and far more geographically isolated, with the nearest significant sources sitting in Afghanistan, in the mountains of Central Asia, thousands of miles from the Mediterranean. Getting tin from Afghanistan to a Mycenaean smith in Greece required a chain of transactions, middlemen, and transport legs that makes modern supply chains look straightforward. Every sword, every shield, every agricultural tool in the Bronze Age world was the end product of a logistical operation that spanned an entire continent. And it was not just metal. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age had developed a level of specialization that locked every player into dependency on the others. Egypt produced grain in quantities that no other civilization in the region could match, and it used that agricultural surplus as a form of strategic power, sending grain to allies during famines, withholding it as diplomatic leverage. The Hittites controlled the mountain passes of Anatolia and dominated the overland trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to Mesopotamia and beyond. Ugarit, positioned perfectly on the Syrian coast, had transformed its geography into an economic asset, becoming the port through which the goods of 3 continents flowed in both directions. Each piece of the system was doing something no other piece could do. That was the strength. That was also the trap. Think about what this means in practice. If you are a palace administrator in Mycenae around 1200 BCE, your ability to arm your soldiers depends on copper arriving from Cyprus and tin arriving from a supply chain originating in Central Asia. Your ability to feed your population during a bad harvest depends on grain ships arriving from Egypt. Your ability to maintain the loyalty of your elite depends on a steady flow of luxury goods, lapis lazuli, ivory, fine textiles, moving through merchants operating out of Ugarit. You're not running a self-sufficient kingdom. You are running a node in a network. And a node, by definition, cannot survive if the network goes down. The palace bureaucracies of the Bronze Age understood this on some level, which is why they invested so heavily in the diplomatic infrastructure that kept the network running. The Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets found in Egypt in the 19th century, preserve nearly 400 pieces of diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh and the rulers of the Hittites, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Cyprus, and the city-states of Canaan. They wrote constantly, sent gifts, arranged royal marriages, and addressed each other as brothers, while complaining when the brotherly gifts were insufficient. They were doing, in clay and cuneiform, exactly what modern states do with embassies and trade agreements and international summits, maintaining the relationships that kept the machine operational. The machine required constant attention, and for 300 years, more or less, they gave it that attention.
But here is what nobody in those palace bureaucracies appears to have fully grasped. Or if they grasp it, they had no mechanism to act on it. The very success of the system was making it more fragile with every passing decade. As trade expanded and specialization deepened, each civilization was quietly shedding capabilities it no longer needed because the network provided them. Why maintain large grain reserves when Egypt reliably supplies you? Why develop local copper smelting when Cyprus reliably ships ingots? Why invest in overland roads when Ugarit handles the transit? Each of these decisions was rational in isolation. Collectively, they were building a civilization that was outsourcing its own survival to a system it could not control and could not replace. It was the Bronze Age version of just-in-time manufacturing, efficient, optimized, and catastrophically brittle. There is a concept in modern systems theory called a single point of failure. It describes a component in a complex system whose failure causes the entire system to fail, because nothing else in the system can perform its function. The late Bronze Age world did not have one single point of failure. It had dozens. Cyprus going offline meant no copper. The Afghan tin routes being disrupted meant no bronze. Egypt contracting inward meant no grain surplus for the region. Ugarit burning meant no hub for Mediterranean commerce. Any one of these, in isolation, would have been a serious crisis, and the Bronze Age had faced serious crises before and recovered. But that recovery always depended on the rest of the network remaining intact, on being able to route around the damage and draw on reserves held elsewhere. What happened around 1200 BCE was something the system had never encountered. Everything started failing at once. And here is the detail that keeps pulling me back every time I look at this history. The one that makes this feel less like an archaeology lesson and more like a mirror. The people running these civilizations were not stupid. The scribes who maintained the palace records, the diplomats who wrote the Amarna letters, the merchants who organized the Uluburun cargo, these were sophisticated professionals who understood their world with remarkable precision. They knew the system was complex. They knew it required maintenance. They spent enormous resources keeping it running. And none of that knowledge, none of that sophistication, none of that diplomatic machinery was sufficient when the pressures that were coming began to arrive simultaneously. Knowing that a system is fragile and being able to save it when it fractures are two entirely different things. So when we talk about the Bronze Age collapse, we are not talking about the failure of a weak civilization that crumbled under pressure it was never equipped to handle. We are talking about the fall of the strongest, most sophisticated, most interconnected civilization the ancient world had ever produced. We are talking about a system that was, by every standard of its time, essentially unbreakable, right up until the moment it broke. What broke it was not a single enemy, not a single catastrophe, not a single catastrophic decision by a single catastrophic king. What broke it was the accumulated weight of its own complexity, stressed by a set of simultaneous pressures that its architecture was never designed to absorb. The machine that could not break finally met the conditions under which it could. And what those conditions actually were is where this story gets very dark indeed.
There is a tell in archaeology, a word that refers to the artificial mound that forms over centuries as civilizations build on top of their own ruins. When you core drill through a tell, you pull up a column of history. Ash layers, pottery shards, burned grain, collapsed walls. And in tell after tell across the eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists drilling through the layers that correspond to around 1200 BCE found something that had nothing to do with armies or politics or trade. They found pollen. Specifically, they found the sudden disappearance of cultivated pollen, wheat, barley, olive, and its replacement by wild grasses and drought-resistant scrub. The fields had stopped being fields, and that change in pollen is one of the most chilling things in the entire archaeological record of the ancient world. The climate data for the Eastern Mediterranean between roughly 1200 and 1100 BCE is, at this point, overwhelming. Tree ring records from ancient timber preserved in archaeological sites, isotope analysis from stalagmites in caves that recorded rainfall patterns with chemical precision, sediment cores from lake beds that preserved centuries of deposited organic material, pollen columns from a dozen different locations across the region. All of it points in the same direction. Beginning around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a prolonged drought. Not a single bad year, not a 2-year dry spell, but a decades-long megadrought that fundamentally altered the agricultural capacity of an entire region. The rains that had sustained the Bronze Age world simply stopped coming with the reliability that palace economies depended on. To understand what this meant, you have to understand how close to the edge Bronze Age agriculture already operated. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were not agricultural systems with large safety margins. They were optimized extraction machines designed to feed urban populations, maintain standing armies, supply craft specialists, and generate surpluses for trade, all simultaneously. Egyptian grain production was calibrated to the Nile flood cycle with a precision that centuries of experience had refined. Hittite agriculture in the Anatolian highlands was always marginal, always dependent on adequate seasonal rainfall. The city-states of the Levant fed themselves and their trading partners with harvests that left little room for consecutive failures. When the rains faltered, there was no buffer. There was just hunger. The letters that survive from this period make the crisis visceral in a way that no climate graph can. A Hittite king, one of the most powerful men on earth by the standards of his time, wrote to the Pharaoh of Egypt with words that are difficult to read 3,000 years later without feeling their desperation. He described his kingdom as facing death. He asked not for gold, not for diplomatic support, not for military alliance. He asked for grain. He asked for ships to carry that grain. He specified the quantities he needed. He said, in terms that left no room for diplomatic ambiguity, that his people were starving. This is a man who commanded armies that had fought Egypt to a standstill, and he was begging for food. The Egyptians were not unaffected themselves. Records from the reign of Ramesses III, who would preside over some of the most violent years of the collapse, document internal food shortages severe enough to trigger what may be the first recorded labor strike in history. Workers building royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings stopped working and marched to the administrative offices demanding their grain rations, which had not been delivered. They sat down and refused to move until they were fed. The state that had once exported grain across the Mediterranean was struggling to feed its own tomb builders. Something had gone profoundly wrong with the system that no amount of diplomatic correspondence could paper over. And here is where the drought becomes not just a humanitarian catastrophe, but a systemic killer. Remember what we established about how the Bronze Age network operated, about how each civilization depended on the others for things it could not produce itself. Now take that interdependent system and introduce a decade of failed harvests across the entire region simultaneously. Egypt, which had been the grain supplier of last resort for the entire Eastern Mediterranean, suddenly had less to export. The Hittites, who had relied on Egyptian grain during bad years, found that the Egyptian lifeline was weakening at precisely the moment they needed it most. The city-states of the Levant, which had fed themselves and generated surpluses for trade, were now struggling to feed themselves at all. The grain that had flowed through Ugarit as a trade commodity began to flow instead as emergency relief, and then stopped flowing altogether, as there was no longer enough of it to move.
But the drought did not just starve people, it moved them. This is the part of the story that most accounts underemphasize, and it is arguably the most consequential effect of the climate catastrophe. When the land stops feeding you, you leave. Farmers in the Anatolian highlands, whose fields had turned to dust, began moving toward the coasts. Pastoral communities in the Aegean, whose grazing lands had dried up, began moving toward the fertile river valleys. Populations that had been relatively stable for generations began to flow, first as trickles, then as streams, then as floods of displaced people looking for land that could still support them. Some of these movements were orderly, many were not. And the Bronze Age world, with its palace-controlled borders and its carefully maintained diplomatic order, had no framework for absorbing population movements of this scale. There is a letter found at Ugarit, one of the last letters the city ever received, found in a kiln where it had been fired but apparently never delivered, from the king of Alatia, which most scholars identify as Cyprus. He warns the king of Ugarit that enemy ships have been sighted off the coast, 7 enemy vessels. He advises the king to fortify his harbour and prepare his defences. The tone is urgent but controlled, the tone of one ruler warning another about a manageable threat. What we know looking back is that this letter arrived at a city that was already on the edge of collapse, in a region that was already fracturing under the pressure of drought and famine and population movement. The 7 ships were not the threat. The 7 ships were a symptom. The threat was everything that had been building for decades beneath the surface of a world that had convinced itself it was unbreakable. The drought, in the end, did not kill the Bronze Age world by itself. It did something more insidious. It drained the system's reserves, the grain stockpiles, the diplomatic goodwill, the political stability that comes from populations that are fed and not desperate. It stressed every node in the network simultaneously, at a time when the network had no slack left in it. It turned a system that had been running at full capacity into a system running beyond full capacity, with no margin for any additional shock. And additional shocks were coming. The drought had set the table. What happened next would sit down to eat.
On the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, carved in stone with the confident permanence of a civilization that expected to last forever, there is a battle scene, unlike anything else in Egyptian art. It shows ships locked in combat on open water, warriors falling into the sea, prisoners being led away in chains. On land, ox carts carry women and children, entire families on the move. And the figures doing the fighting, the figures the Egyptian artists carved with such careful detail, are not Egyptians. They wear feathered headdresses, carry long swords of a type Egyptian soldiers did not use, and they are coming, the inscriptions tell us, from the sea. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, and 3,000 years later, we still do not know with certainty who they were. This is not false modesty on the part of historians. The Sea Peoples are one of the most debated questions in the entire field of ancient history, and the debate is genuine because the evidence is genuinely contradictory. What we know is this. Beginning around 1200 BCE and continuing for several decades, waves of migrants and raiders struck the eastern Mediterranean coastline with enough force to destroy cities, overwhelm local defenses, and destabilize entire kingdoms. The Egyptians documented them extensively. Too extensively, some scholars argue, in the sense that Egyptian records were propaganda as much as history, and Ramses III had strong political incentives to portray himself as the heroic defender of civilization against an overwhelming external threat. The question of how much to trust Egyptian accounts of the Sea Peoples is itself a subject of ongoing scholarly argument. The Egyptians gave us names for the various groups they identified among the sea peoples: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. Some of these names have been tentatively connected to peoples we know from other sources. The Peliset are often identified with the Philistines, who appear later in the Levant. The Denyen, possibly with the Danaans of Greek tradition. But tentatively is the operative word. The connections are plausible, not proven. And the deeper question, where did all these groups come from, and why were they moving, is one that the Egyptian inscriptions do not answer. Because the Egyptians did not particularly care about the answer. They cared about defeating these people, not understanding them. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange, and where I want you to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. The traditional narrative of the Bronze Age collapse, the narrative that dominated scholarship for most of the 20th century, treated the sea peoples as the primary cause of the collapse. Waves of barbaric invaders from outside the civilized world swept through the eastern Mediterranean, burning cities and destroying kingdoms too weakened to resist. It was a clean story, an external enemy, a civilizational clash. It had the satisfying structure of a catastrophe with a clear perpetrator. The problem is that the more carefully archaeologists have examined the evidence, the less this narrative holds together. Because when you look at the destruction layers in the cities that burned, and there are many of them across a wide geographic area, the picture that emerges is not consistent with a single group of invaders moving in a single direction. Some cities show evidence of having been attacked from the sea. Others show evidence of land-based assault. Some show evidence of internal destruction, fires that started from within, not without. Some show no evidence of violent destruction at all, just abandonment. The people left, taking what they could carry, and never came back. The idea that one coherent group of sea peoples swept through the Mediterranean, burning everything in their path, does not match what the ground is actually telling us. What the ground suggests instead is something more complex and, in a way, more disturbing. Many scholars now believe that the sea peoples were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but one of its symptoms. That the population movements the Egyptians recorded, the families on ox carts, the warriors fighting for new land, were themselves the product of the same drought, famine, and systemic breakdown that was stressing every other part of the Bronze Age world simultaneously. That the sea peoples were, in significant part, refugees. Displaced populations from the Aegean, from Anatolia, from the collapsing Hittite periphery, from anywhere the land had stopped supporting life. People who were not invading a civilization so much as desperately trying to find one that still functioned. And in their desperation, they were accelerating the very collapse they were fleeing. Think about what this means for a moment. If the sea peoples were substantially refugees from earlier stages of the collapse, then the Bronze Age world was not destroyed by an outside force. It was, in a very real sense, destroyed by its own displaced population, by the human overflow of a system that had stopped being able to feed and support the people who depended on it. The cities that burned did not burn because barbarians arrived from nowhere. They burned because the network that had sustained them had already failed, because the people pouring across their borders were hungry and armed and had nowhere else to go, and because the palace armies that were supposed to defend those cities were themselves weakened by the same shortages that were driving the migrants forward. It was a feedback loop, not an invasion. And feedback loops are much harder to stop than armies. The Egyptian accounts, read in this light, become something different from triumphalist propaganda. Ramesses III did defeat a significant incursion. The battle scenes had Medinet Habu almost certainly record real events. But Egypt itself was already damaged by this point, already running short on grain, already dealing with internal instability. The victory that Ramesses carved in stone so proudly was a victory that cost Egypt more than it could afford. Within a generation of his reign, Egypt would retreat from its imperial territories in Canaan, abandon its foreign policy ambitions, and begin the long contraction that would eventually reduce it from the dominant power of the Mediterranean world to a regional kingdom that stronger neighbors could push around. Egypt survived the Sea Peoples. It did not survive the collapse intact. And here is the question that I find genuinely impossible to shake. If the Sea Peoples were largely refugees, if they were people fleeing a dying world rather than destroyers of a healthy one, then the Bronze Age collapse produced one of the most tragic dynamics in human history. A civilization under stress generated refugees. Those refugees, moving through a world that could no longer absorb them, put additional stress on every system they touched. That additional stress generated more collapse, which generated more refugees, which generated more stress. The civilization did not fall to an outside enemy. It fell to the human consequences of its own internal failures, amplified and accelerated by the movement of desperate people across borders that no longer had the strength to hold. If you're looking for a historical precedent that feels uncomfortably contemporary, you have just found one. The Sea Peoples remain, in the end, a mystery, with edges that scholarship keeps refining but cannot fully resolve. We know they existed. We know they moved. We know some of them settled in the Levant and became peoples who appear later in the biblical record. We know they contributed to the destruction of cities that were already under pressure. What we cannot say with confidence is exactly who they were, exactly where they came from, or exactly how much of the collapse they caused versus how much they merely accelerated. But perhaps the most honest thing we can say about the Sea Peoples is also the most unsettling. They may have been less like a wave that drowned a civilization, and more like a mirror that showed it what it had already become. In 1929, a Syrian farmer plowing a field near the coast accidentally broke through the roof of an ancient tomb. The site that archaeologists subsequently excavated turned out to be Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the Bronze Age, a place mentioned in hundreds of ancient texts, a hub of international commerce that had operated for centuries. They found palaces, temples, warehouses, residential neighborhoods, and an archive of clay tablets in multiple languages that rewrote the history of the ancient Near East. They also found something that no amount of academic preparation quite readies you for: a city frozen in the moment of its death. Bread still in the ovens, tools still on the workshop floors, a letter, as we have already seen, still waiting to be delivered. Ugarit did not decline. It did not transition. It stopped all at once, like a clock that someone smashed. The destruction layer at Ugarit dates to around 1185 BCE, give or take a decade. Above that layer, there is nothing. No rebuilding, no reoccupation, no later settlement that grew up on the ruins, as happens with almost every other destroyed city in the ancient world. Just soil and silence, and eventually, a Syrian farmer's plow breaking through 3,000 years of accumulated earth. Archaeologists have a clinical term for this kind of site: a destruction horizon. But clinical language does not capture what it actually means to stand in front of an unfinished letter baked into a clay tablet and understand that the person who was writing it never came back to finish the sentence. Ugarit was not abandoned. It was interrupted. Walk with me through the ruins of these cities, because the physical evidence tells a story that documents alone cannot. At Ugarit, the final destruction shows evidence of intense fire. Roofs collapsed inward, burned timber preserved under fallen stone, bronze objects melted in place. But the fires did not spread uniformly through the city. They started in multiple locations simultaneously or in rapid succession, which suggests either a coordinated attack or a chaotic situation in which multiple things went wrong at once. The warehouses near the harbor, which should have been full of trade goods given the city's function as a commercial hub, were largely empty by the time the fire came. The ships had stopped arriving. The goods had stopped moving. The city had been bleeding out economically for some time before the final blow landed. Mycenae tells a different story, and a different story again from what you might expect. The famous citadel, with its cyclopean walls and its lion gate, was not burned and sacked in the manner of Ugarit. It was, instead, progressively abandoned over a period of decades. The palace emptied, the administrative functions ceased, the population contracted. There is evidence of fire in some areas, evidence of hasty construction of additional defensive walls late in the process, evidence of a community that knew something was wrong and was trying to respond to it. But there is no single catastrophic destruction event at Mycenae, the way there is at Ugarit. The palace simply stopped functioning. The scribes stopped writing. The Linear B tablets, the administrative records that documented grain allocations, personnel lists, military equipment, end abruptly. And with them, literacy itself vanished from the Greek world for roughly 400 years. 400 years without writing. Let that sit for a moment. The Mycenaean Greeks were a literate, administratively sophisticated people with palace bureaucracies, specialized craft production, and long-distance trade networks. Within a century of the collapse, their descendants were living in small, largely isolated agricultural communities with no writing, no monumental architecture, no long-distance trade to speak of, and no apparent memory of what their ancestors had built. When the Greeks eventually redeveloped writing in the 8th century BCE, they did not revive Linear B. They adopted a completely different script from the Phoenicians, because the knowledge of how to read and write the old way had been entirely lost. The collapse did not set Greek civilization back a generation. It set it back half a millennium. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, is perhaps the most dramatic case of all. Here was a city of 30,000 people, the administrative heart of a superpower that had fielded armies of 40,000 soldiers and negotiated with Egypt as an equal. It had massive temples, a royal palace complex, enormous grain storage facilities, walls stretching for kilometers across the Anatolian plateau. When archaeologists excavated it, they found that it had been systematically emptied before it burned. The grain stores were depleted. The valuable goods were gone. The population had left in an organized fashion, taking what they could carry. And then the city burned. Deliberately, it appears, set alight by the people who were leaving, or by someone immediately behind them. The Hittite Empire did not fall in battle. Its capital was evacuated and torched. Whatever happened, the people who abandoned Hattusa knew they were not coming back. Across the Levant, the pattern repeats with variations. Megiddo shows destruction layers. Hatzor burned violently. Lachish was destroyed and then reoccupied by people with a noticeably simpler material culture, people who did not build with the same techniques, did not maintain the same administrative systems, did not produce the same quality of goods. Ashdod was destroyed and rebuilt, destroyed again and rebuilt again. The archaeological signature of the period is not uniform catastrophe. It is something messier, and in some ways more disturbing. A region with the infrastructure of civilization, the palace economies, the specialized craft production, the long-distance trade, the administrative literacy, collapsed almost everywhere, while individual communities survived in fragments, diminished, isolated, no longer connected to the network that had given them their sophistication. There is one site that has contributed more to our understanding of the collapse than almost any other, and it is not on land. The Uluburun shipwreck that we discussed earlier, with its 10 tons of copper and its cargo from 7 civilizations, was not a unique vessel. It was representative of a type of commerce that was constant and routine during the height of the Bronze Age. After around 1150 BCE, ships of that kind essentially disappear from the archaeological record. The harbors that serviced them either burned or emptied. The merchant families that operated them either died or scattered. The logistical infrastructure that made it possible to load a ship with goods from 7 different cultures and send it across the Mediterranean on a commercial run ceased to exist. And it did not come back for centuries. The sea that had connected the Bronze Age world became almost overnight, in historical terms, a much more dangerous and much lonelier place.
What the archaeology ultimately tells us, across dozens of sites, across multiple countries, across a period of roughly 50 years, is that the Bronze Age collapse was not a single event. It was a cascade. Cities fell at different times in different ways for reasons that varied from location to location. Some burned violently. Some were evacuated. Some shrank gradually into shadows of themselves. Some were simply abandoned, left standing but empty, their last inhabitants walking away into a world that had no place for the kind of complexity those cities had represented. The cascade moved through the system the way a power grid failure moves through an electrical network, not all at once, but in a sequence of failures where each one increased the stress on everything still connected to it. And when it was over, when the ash had settled and the silence had established itself over city after city, what remained was a world that was recognizably the same geography, but almost unrecognizably different in every other sense. The palaces were gone. The scribes were gone. The long-distance trade was gone. The diplomatic correspondence was gone. The specialized craftsmen who had made the luxury goods that had moved through Ugarit and across the Mediterranean, gone. The people who had survived were still there, living in the ruins or in the countryside around them, farming, herding, making do with simpler tools and simpler social structures. They had inherited a landscape full of monuments they could no longer explain. And slowly, over centuries, they would begin to build something new from the wreckage. But that is a different story. First, we have to understand why the wreckage was so total.
There is a concept that engineers use when analyzing catastrophic failures in complex systems. They call it a cascade failure, a sequence of events in which the failure of one component places additional stress on neighboring components, causing them to fail in turn, until the entire system has collapsed in a chain reaction that no single intervention point could have stopped. The classic example is a power grid blackout. One transformer overloads. The load shifts to adjacent transformers. They overload. The failure spreads outward faster than any human operator can respond. And in minutes, a system that was functioning perfectly is dark across thousands of miles. The engineers who study these failures have a phrase for the conditions that make them possible. They call it being in a brittle state. And the Bronze Age world, by around 1200 BCE, was as brittle as it had ever been. We have already examined the individual pressures separately, the structural interdependency, the megadrought, the population movements, the military incursions. But the reason the Bronze Age collapse was so total, so fast, and so permanent is precisely that these pressures did not arrive sequentially, giving each civilization time to recover before the next blow landed. They arrived simultaneously, or close enough to simultaneously that the distinction did not matter. The drought was already stressing agricultural systems when the population movements began. The population movements were already destabilizing border regions when the raids intensified. The raids were already disrupting trade when the palace economies began running short on the materials they needed to function. Each crisis fed the others. Each failure made the next failure more likely. This is not a story of a civilization that was attacked.
It is a story of a civilization that was caught in a trap of its own construction, and then the trap was sprung. Let us build the sequence as carefully as the evidence allows. The drought begins somewhere around 1200 BCE, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a gradual tightening, a series of below-average rainfall years that eventually becomes a decade of genuine crisis. Harvests across the eastern Mediterranean begin to fall short. The grain surpluses that Egypt normally exported to the region shrink and then effectively disappear. The Hittites, whose Anatolian agriculture was always marginal, begin to experience genuine famine in some regions. Palace administrators across the Levant start drawing down the grain reserves that were supposed to be emergency buffers. The diplomatic letters multiply, full of requests for food assistance that the recipients increasingly cannot fulfill. The system is stressed, but it is still functioning. It has survived droughts before. The administrators are managing. But managing a drought in an interdependent system has a cost that the Bronze Age world was not positioned to absorb. To feed populations that the land could no longer support, palaces had to drain their reserves. To drain their reserves, they had to reduce the grain they normally allocated to other functions, to the specialist craftsmen, to the military garrisons, to the merchants whose operations lubricated the trade network. The trade network, already disrupted by the insecurity that drought and population movement were generating along the major routes, began to contract. Less tin was moving from the east. Less copper was moving from Cyprus. The smiths, who made the tools and weapons that palace economies depended on, were producing less, because the raw materials were arriving less reliably. The military capacity that those palaces depended on for their security was quietly degrading at precisely the moment when security was becoming more urgent. Now add the population movements. Displaced communities from the Aegean periphery, from Anatolia, from regions where the agricultural system had already failed, were flowing into areas that were themselves already under stress. Some of these movements were peaceful, migrants looking for land, willing to integrate into existing communities. Many were not. Groups that were hungry, armed, and had nothing left to lose were not in a position to negotiate politely for access to resources. They took what they needed. The coastal raids that Egyptian records document so vividly were not, in most cases, the actions of organized military forces with strategic objectives. They were the actions of desperate people who had discovered that raiding was more reliable than farming in a world where farming had stopped working. The distinction matters enormously, because you can negotiate with an army. You cannot negotiate with famine. The internal pressures were, if anything, more dangerous than the external ones. Palace economies were fundamentally extractive systems. They worked by concentrating agricultural surplus at the center and redistributing it as rations to specialists, soldiers, and administrators. When the surplus shrank, the redistribution shrank with it. When redistribution shrank, the specialists and soldiers who depended on palace rations became unreliable, resentful, or simply left to find food elsewhere. The Egyptian labor strike we mentioned earlier was not an isolated incident. Across the Bronze Age world, there is evidence of internal instability, elite competition for dwindling resources, breakdowns in the administrative systems that kept palace economies running, local strongmen filling power vacuums that weakened central governments could no longer project authority into. The palaces were not just being attacked from outside, they were rotting from within. Cyprus, the Saudi Arabia of the Bronze Age, remember, shows a particularly instructive trajectory during this period. The island's copper industry did not collapse suddenly. It contracted gradually, as the trading partners who normally bought Cypriot copper became less able to pay for it, as the ships that normally carried it became less safe to operate, as the administrative systems that organized its production and export came under increasing strain. The great copper-producing cities of Cyprus show destruction layers,
But they also show evidence of a longer decline before the final destruction. Shrinking production, simpler material culture, reduced trade contacts. The heart of the Bronze Age industrial economy was not cut out. It slowly stopped beating. And here is what makes the cascade failure complete and what distinguishes the Bronze Age collapse from the many earlier crises that the system had absorbed and recovered from. In every previous crisis, at least some major nodes of the network remained functional. Egypt could supply grain, Cyprus could supply copper, Ugarit could facilitate trade. The system could route around damage because there was always something to route through. By around 1150 BCE, there was nothing left to route through. Egypt had contracted behind its borders. The Hittite Empire had ceased to exist. Ugarit was ash. The Mycenaean palaces were empty. Cyprus was diminished to a fraction of its former output. The network did not just lose nodes. It lost the minimum number of nodes required to keep the network functioning at all. Below a certain threshold of connectivity, a network does not limp along in a weakened state. It stops being a network. There is a question that historians have debated for decades about the Bronze Age collapse, and it is worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly. Could it have been prevented?
Were there decisions that different kings, different administrators, different diplomatic strategies might have made that would have changed the outcome? The honest answer is that we do not know. What we can say is that the structural conditions that made the collapse possible, the extreme interdependency, the lack of redundancy, the optimization for efficiency over resilience, were baked into the system long before the pressures that broke it arrived. The Bronze Age world did not make a single catastrophic mistake. It made 3 centuries of individually rational decisions that collectively produced a civilization too finely tuned to survive the kind of simultaneous, compounding stress that arrived around 1200 BCE. It was not stupid. It was optimized. And in complex systems, optimization and fragility are often the same thing. By the time the last palace fires had burned out and the last trading ship had rotted in an abandoned harbor, the Bronze Age world had not merely suffered a setback. It had been structurally dismantled. The people survived, scattered and diminished. The land survived, scarred but still fertile. But the system, the interconnected, interdependent, sophisticated machine that had made the late Bronze Age the most complex civilization the ancient world had ever produced, was gone. Not damaged, not weakened. Gone. And what rose in its place would take centuries to reach anything approaching the same level of complexity. The perfect storm had passed. The world it left behind would have to start in many ways almost from scratch. The world that existed on the other side of the Bronze Age collapse was not the same world. This sounds obvious when you say it, but the full weight of what it means takes a moment to absorb. The people who lived through the collapse and the generations immediately after it did not experience a setback. They did not experience a period of rebuilding from a damaged foundation. They experienced the disappearance of the foundation itself. The trade networks, the palace economies, the administrative literacy, the diplomatic infrastructure, the specialized craft production that had defined sophisticated life for 3 centuries. What they were left with was geography and memory, and even the memory faded fast. Within a few generations, the Bronze Age world was not a recent catastrophe. It was a myth. It was the age of heroes. It was a time so remote and so different that the only way to explain the ruins it had left behind was to invent giants. But here is the thing about total collapse that history keeps demonstrating. It is also total permission. When a system fails completely enough, it does not just destroy what existed, it clears the ground. And on ground that has been cleared completely, things can grow that could never have competed with what was there before. The 4 centuries that followed the Bronze Age collapse, the period historians call the Greek Dark Ages, which is an accurate name for how dark it actually was for the people living through it, were not simply a void between 2 periods of civilization. They were an incubation. Slow, painful, largely invisible in the archaeological record, but real. And what incubated in that darkness would eventually produce something the Bronze Age world had never managed to create. The alphabet is the most important thing that came out of the ruins. Not the alphabet as a curiosity or a cultural artifact, but the alphabet as a technology. Specifically, as a technology that democratized literacy in a way that the syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age never had. Linear B, the Mycenaean script, required years of specialized training to master. Cuneiform, the script of Mesopotamia, was similarly complex. These were not writing systems designed to be learned by ordinary people. They were administrative tools operated by a professional scribal class in service of palace bureaucracies. When the palaces fell, the scribes vanished with them, and writing vanished too. But when the Phoenicians, survivors of the collapse operating out of the Lebanese coast, developed and spread their simplified alphabetic script, they created something fundamentally different. 22 letters, no specialist training required. Anyone could learn to read and write. The Greeks adopted it in the 8th century BCE, added vowels, and the result is the alphabet you are using right now to read these words. Iron is the other great gift of the collapse, and it arrived in a way that perfectly illustrates how necessity and catastrophe can be the same event. Bronze Age civilization ran on bronze, and bronze required tin and copper moving through a trade network that no longer existed after the collapse. When the network failed and the bronze stopped flowing, the civilizations that survived had to find another metal. Iron ore was common, far more common than copper, almost universally present in the soils of the Mediterranean world. The technology to work it was harder to master than bronze working, but it did not require a continental supply chain. A village with iron ore and a skilled smith could arm itself, could farm effectively, could rebuild. Iron did not save the Bronze Age world. The Bronze Age world was already gone. But iron made it possible for the world that replaced it to be less dependent, less fragile, less vulnerable to the exact kind of systemic collapse that had just erased everything. The lesson was absorbed, if not consciously understood. The political structures that emerged from the collapse were also, in a very specific way, a response to the failure mode that the Bronze Age had demonstrated. The palace economy, the system in which a central administrative authority controlled production, distribution, and trade, essentially disappeared and never fully returned to the Eastern Mediterranean in its Bronze Age form. What replaced it, slowly and unevenly over centuries, were city-states, tribal confederacies, and eventually the early republican and democratic experiments that we associate with classical Greece. These were not more sophisticated structures than the Bronze Age palace system in every respect. In some ways, they were simpler, but they were more distributed, more redundant, less dependent on any single node. The Greek city-states of the classical period fought each other constantly and drove historians of later centuries to distraction with their inability to maintain unity. But they also survived the failure of any individual state without pulling the whole system down with it. Athens could fall, and Sparta could continue. Corinth could be destroyed, and the Greek world did not end. That resilience was, in a very real sense, the Bronze Age collapse's most important political legacy. The Phoenicians deserve particular attention in this story because they represent the most direct line of continuity between the Bronze Age world and what came after it. Operating from their coastal cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, they maintained trading operations through the collapse and rebuilt them afterward, becoming the commercial backbone of the early Iron Age Mediterranean. They spread the alphabet. They established colonies across the Western Mediterranean, including the city of Carthage,
which would eventually become Rome's most dangerous rival. They carried the memory of Bronze Age trading practices into a new world that had forgotten almost everything else about its predecessor. The Phoenicians were not glamorous in the way that Egypt or the Hittites were glamorous. They did not build monuments or write epic poetry about their kings. They built ships and kept records and maintained relationships across political boundaries. They were, in other words, exactly the kind of people that the Bronze Age network had depended on, and they were among the very few who survived it well enough to build something new.
Now here is where I need you to stop thinking about the ancient world for a moment and start thinking about your own. Because the Bronze Age collapse is not just a historical curiosity about civilizations that no longer exist. It is a case study in how complexity fails, and the conditions it describes are not unique to 3,000 years ago. We live in a world more interconnected and more interdependent than anything the Bronze Age produced. Global supply chains that stretch across dozens of countries for a single manufactured product. Financial systems so deeply interlocked that a bank failure in one country can trigger recessions on the other side of the planet. Agricultural systems that feed billions of people through a network of production, transportation, and distribution that requires thousands of things to go right simultaneously. Digital infrastructure that underlies nearly every critical system in modern civilization and that concentrates enormous amounts of functional dependency in a small number of physical and institutional nodes. The Bronze Age world was the most complex civilization of its time. We are the most complex civilization of ours. That parallel is not comforting. The scholars who study systemic collapse, and there are more of them now than there used to be, which is itself a data point worth noting, identify the same risk factors across historical cases: extreme interdependency, optimized efficiency with minimal redundancy, supply chains with single points of failure, governance structures that are good at managing normal conditions and poor at managing cascading crises, and the accumulated brittleness that comes from a long period of stability during which the memory of catastrophic failure fades and the precautions that memory once motivated get quietly dismantled as inefficient. The Bronze Age world had all of these. The question of whether we do is one I will leave for you to answer, because you already know what the answer is. What I keep coming back to after spending time with this history is not the scale of the destruction. It is the speed of the forgetting. Within a century of the collapse, the people living in the ruins of Mycenae did not know what Mycenae had been. Within 2 centuries, the Hittite Empire, which had been one of the great superpowers of the ancient world, which had fought Egypt to a standstill and signed history's first surviving international peace treaty, had been so completely forgotten that scholars in the 19th century CE refused to believe it had existed at all because no Greek or Roman source mentioned it. An entire superpower erased from memory in 200 years. The Bronze Age world was not just destroyed. It was forgotten so thoroughly that it took the invention of modern archaeology to prove it had existed. If the people who lived through the collapse could not remember what they had lost, what makes us think we would be any different? The ruins are still there. The ash layers are still there. The unfinished letters baked into clay are still there, waiting in museum cases for anyone patient enough to read them. They are not asking for sympathy. They are not asking to be mourned. They are asking, in the most concrete way that history ever asks anything, a single question. What do you do with this information? The Bronze Age world built something extraordinary, made it fragile through its own success, watched it collapse under pressures it was not designed to absorb, and left behind a set of lessons that took humanity 3,000 years to fully excavate. We have excavated them now. The question is whether we are listening.